Welcome back again. Today I will cover 3 shocking true crime cases from the United States. But before we start, please comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now, and press the like button. Let's get to it. He was watering his lawn when they closed in. An elderly man in a quiet Sacramento suburb. A lab had linked him to crimes that had terrorized California for decades. A DNA match, a name, Joseph James D'Angelo. But how did he hide in plain sight for so long? Why did the attacks escalate the way they did? And who was he when he walked through his front door at night? To understand that arrest, we need to go back to the first intrusions, when the pattern began forming in the dark. In the mid-1970s, Sacramento's new subdivisions promised safety, cul-de-sacs, trimmed lawns, open windows on cool nights. Then someone started watching. Windows were found pried. Screens lay neatly set aside. Dogs barked at nothing. In hindsight, the prelude was there. Phone calls that clicked, a line that suddenly went dead, footprints in flower beds where nobody should have been walking. The psychology of the moment is important. He rehearsed control before he took it. He learned schedules, the routes to school, the sound of a sliding glass door at 2 a.m. He loosened porch lights, marked fences with small disturbances, and returned again and again until a house felt mapped. When he finally entered, he moved like someone who had practiced in silence. He carried ligatures, shoelaces, cords, bindings he had brought or found on site. He used a small flashlight to command the room, a narrow beam in eyes already waking to fear. Couples were separated. The man tied first, marched into another room, sometimes the garage, sometimes the living room floor. Dishes were stacked on a back, a crude alarm. If they fell, he promised to kill. It was control, rehearsed and ritualized. Survivors described a voice, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a hiss through clenched teeth. Orders came in a loop. Don't move. Do what I say. I'll be gone soon. He rifled drawers, ate in kitchens, stood in hallways for long stretches listening to the house breathe. The phone would ring days or months later, a whisper or a quiet exhale, as if he needed to prove he could still reach them. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Here, horror arrived fully formed, then lingered on the line. Forensic evidence in those early years was thin. He wore gloves, he wiped surfaces, he prepositioned bindings, sometimes cached items in yards before the attack. Detectives found minimal trace, shoe impressions in damp soil, a partial tread pattern, knots on ligatures that suggested practice. There were composite sketches from fragments, a narrow face, a knit cap, a mask, but sketches are not fingerprints, and fear distorted memory. What stands out now in retrospect is that the craft was evident early, the methodical approach, the planned exits, the way he chose houses near canals and bike paths for quick escapes. Law enforcement responded with scale. Community meetings filled school auditoriums. Officers taught residents to hammer in window dowels, to lock sliding doors, to check shrub lines. Task forces formed. Patrols intensified. Helicopters pulsed over neighborhoods at night. There were stakeouts and decoys, but he stayed just outside the net, turning his knowledge of police routines into an advantage. But here's the twist. He seemed to anticipate patterns, a squad's rotation, a neighborhood watch schedule, even the effect of media coverage on patrol routes. Escalation signals emerged. At first, there were prowls and burglaries, clothes moved, drawers ransacked, a token taken. Then came home invasions, sexual assaults, and sustained control over hours. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Daylight surveillance grew bolder. Residents reported a man on a bicycle, a jogger who did not sweat, a car idling near levees. Dogs were found sedated, gates left open, the sense of safety evaporated. Microstories captured the human cost. A mother who slept with a hammer by her bed for years. A couple who changed bedrooms every week to feel unpredictable. A teenager whose phone rang at dinner, a whisper on the other end that froze the table. Those are not statistics. They are scars that shape how a person moves through the world. Investigators assembled a pattern, mapped pins on large boards, and shared details across the Sacramento area. But the pattern depended on where you stood. Jurisdictional boundaries mattered. A case on one side of a county line lived in one file cabinet. A nearly identical one across the line lived somewhere else. The term for this is linkage blindness, separate eyes on the same offender, no unified view. The attacks clustered, then paused. Patrols tightened. The community adapted. Everything was about to change when his geography shifted south. While Sacramento adjusted locks and routines, reports in the south crept onto different desks. A prowler in Ventura, a cut screen in Goleta, a couple attacked in their home in Orange County. Linkage blindness, again, the name changed, the behavior stayed consistent. What investigators in the capital knew as the East Area Rapist would be called the original Night Stalker down south, as if a new offender had arrived. He had not. The geography had shifted. The stakes had deepened. The psychology of the moment is important. He carried the same rehearsed control into new neighborhoods, but the endgame hardened. He still staged dominance, bindings, threats, whispered commands, but now lethal follow-through answered resistance, or simply completed the ritual. In Goleta, a planned double attack fractured. A couple broke free, chaos erupted. A bicycle was abandoned, a gun left behind. It looked sloppy, but the pattern underneath did not change. Pre-attack surveillance, entry points softened days earlier, escape routes planned along culverts and bike paths. Crime scene consistency tied these worlds together. Ligatures, often found on-site, but arranged as if pre-selected. Windows pried with quiet tools, knots that echoed Sacramento. He sometimes removed bullets from victims or collected casings, aware of ballistic comparisons across jurisdictions. That detail matters. It shows a student of police procedure, absorbing lessons from headlines and community meetings, then iterating. He wiped, he washed, he moved bodies to obstruct patterns in blood. Staging appeared in small ways, curtains drawn post-attack, phones taken off the hook, items stacked that served no obvious purpose except to slow discovery. Meanwhile, investigative fragmentation widened. Ventura County held one set of photos, Orange another, Santa Barbara another. Evidence lockers preserved pieces of a single offender, labeled under separate names. Task forces, already stretched, calibrated to local terror. A detective in one county saw domination and homicide. A detective 2 hours away saw a similar knot, a similar ligature, but lacked the connective tissue. What stands out now in retrospect is that the map was complete only in hindsight. Micro-stories from the south echo the early pattern, but with a cruel finality. A neighbor remembered a man jogging at dusk who never waved back. A homeowner kept finding doors unlocked, as if the house disagreed with her. A dog growled at a corner of the yard where shoe impressions, later, would be photographed. Inside, the voice remained low, almost bored. Orders repeated, a threat delivered with the same cadence. Survivors in Sacramento had described years earlier. The ritual traveled intact, but here's the twist. The pauses extended, the intervals between crimes grew longer, as if he needed to cool the heat he generated. Each pause fed the illusion of separate offenders. A letter to a newspaper here, a poem there, crank calls that might belong to him or to the noise around him. Investigators had to separate signal from echo. And yet, for all this, the fingerprints of method were there. Telephone lines disabled, shoelaces cut to consistent lengths, footprints suggesting a similar shoe size, a similar gait. One scene in particular sharpened the sense of rehearsal. A residence near a greenbelt in Irvine. Entry was quiet. A sliding door compromised weeks earlier. Inside, bindings were applied with speed. Post-attack, items were rearranged, pictures tilted, drawers pulled just enough to suggest ransack without chaos. He left with very little. He left almost nothing of himself. The immediate consequence was absolute. 2 lives ended. A community jolted. The ripple effect was worse. People began to believe that safety itself was an illusion, that the rituals of home, locking up, turning on a porch light, were ceremonial rather than protective. What nobody knew at the time, or could prove, was that this was one offender moving through phases. Power, humiliation, rituals, rehearsed scripts. These were not improvisations. They were habits, adapted to new terrain. He tested doors in tract homes under orange sodium street lamps, then drove oceanside boulevards where the sound of surf covered his exit. The geography strategy worked. Cases did not share databases, detectives did not share radio channels, and the public read each headline as a new storm cloud, rather than the same system passing overhead. Then came years of silence. Not necessarily inactivity, silence. The file drawers stayed full, the evidence sealed, the names different. The communities tried to move on, but survivors did not. The psychology of survival is durable. Hypervigilance becomes a daily ritual. Sleep remains shallow. Small noises wake the body to fight. Investigators retired with boxes they could not let go of. Others inherited those boxes and found the same knots, the same bindings, the same patterns, but no way to prove the bridge between north and south. For years, no laboratory could build that bridge. And then new science walked into the case file. CODIS had nothing. The preserved DNA profile from Southern homicides sat in the national database for years, waiting for a direct hit that never came. Why? Because the offender's DNA was not already in a law enforcement repository. The science could tell you the same man committed multiple murders, but it could not tell you his name. The cases were linked biologically, but identity remained sealed. For detectives who had watched the case age, this felt like a locked door with the key on the other side of a glass pane. Then a different idea surfaced, one that borrowed crowdsourced genealogy to work backward from identity. Forensic genealogy does not need the offender to be in a criminal database. It needs relatives, even distant ones, to have uploaded their DNA to open-source platforms where people build family trees. Investigators can legally upload a crime scene profile, converted to a consumer-compatible format, into a public site and look for partial overlaps. Not perfect matches, but second, third, even fourth cousins. It is like finding a shoreline by dropping a stone in a lake and watching the ripples. What happens after that match appears? The method is part science, part painstaking genealogy. Specialists map out the family branches around the match, then expand, generation by generation, adding marriages, births, relocations, military service, and occupations. Meanwhile, something else is happening. Detectives overlay geography and time. Who in these family branches lived in California during the relevant years? Who was male, within a plausible age band? Familiar with police tactics? Familiar with the neighborhoods that were hit? The tree narrowed. Multiple branches converged on a cluster of relatives with roots in California. Among the living candidates, one stood out. Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer, trained in the very jurisdictions that struggled with the offender's tactics. Fired in the late 1970s after a shoplifting incident in Auburn. The psychology of the moment is important. That firing mattered because it placed him in the region and inside a profession whose procedures the offender seemed to understand. In hindsight, the overlap is chilling. Patrol experience in Sacramento County, then a disappearance from public service as the attacks migrated. But a name is a theory until a lab confirms it. Investigators moved quietly. They conducted surveillance at D'Angelo's suburban home, a tidy place that looked like retirement. They watched his routines, ordinary and unremarkable. Trash out, errands, garage work. What stands out now in retrospect is that the endgame depended on something simple: discarded DNA. A tissue, a swab from a car door handle, refused lawfully recovered without breaching privacy inside the home. The sample went to the lab. The profile clicked against the preserved crime scene DNA. The probability of error was infinitesimal. The bridge that CODIS could not build appeared in a single spreadsheet cell. Match. Arrest day came without spectacle. Neighbors saw an older man, surprised, led to a car. No chase, no confession. The double life surfaced in quiet layers. A family man with a reputation for temper, a hobbyist tinkering in a garage, a retiree watering his lawn. Meanwhile, detectives carried warrants into storage areas, searching for tokens, weapons, documents, anything that might explain decades of erasure. He said almost nothing, but the files he had helped create, through fear, through forensic caution, began to talk for him. In the aftermath, the courtroom became a ledger. Charges from multiple counties were consolidated. Survivors and families listened to a roll call of names, dates, addresses, the clinical language of evidence finally tied to a face. Please leave a like and subscribe for daily true crime stories. This was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a slow accounting, the record asserting itself after years when rumor had filled the vacuum. What nobody knew at the time of those early crimes was that a future tool would unmask him by turning family history into a map. The ethical debate came with it. Privacy, consent, the boundaries of public databases. But here's the twist. The method used publicly available resources, and contributors had agreed to potential law enforcement access under site policies. The ripple effect was immediate. Other cold cases reopened, genealogists collaborated with detectives, and prosecutors learned to present tree-building methods to juries without confusing them. The analogy prosecutors used was simple. You cannot see the offender, but you can see the shadow he casts through relatives. For survivors, the impact was sharper than the technology. A voice they had tried to forget had a name. Locks changed decades too late. Sleep came easier for some, harder for others, because the mind, after so long in vigilance, does not relax on command. Investigators who had retired returned to court to watch the pages turn. The science finally did what neighborhood watches, composite sketches, and stakeouts could not. The mask fell, not with a confession, but with a family tree and a quiet swab. On paper, he looked unremarkable. A modest house in Citrus Heights, a truck in the driveway, tools arranged in careful rows inside a garage that smelled of solvents and old rubber. Neighbors saw routine: yard work, minor repairs, quiet trips to the hardware store. He fished, he tinkered, he kept to himself. The ordinariness was a shield, but it also reflected something colder: compartmentalization taken to an extreme. The psychology of the moment is important. Control was not only for victims, it was his operating system at home. There were slips. A temper that detonated over small inconveniences. A shoplifting arrest in Auburn in the late 1970s for dog repellent, and a hammer ended his police career. That detail seems mundane until you consider his methods. Animal control spray and striking tools echo the practical logistics of his crimes. Later, neighbors remembered profanity-laced outbursts at nothing in particular. A man pacing a driveway, yelling into the air, then returning to work like a switch had flipped. Behavioral bleed-through, contained by privacy and suburban norms that mistake distance for harmlessness. Inside that quiet life, family navigated a man whose rage had rules only he understood. Doors slammed, a glare that emptied rooms, yet birthdays were marked, groceries purchased, routines preserved. This is the dissonance survivors talk about, the idea that a person can perform normalcy so consistently that even proximity does not breed suspicion. It is unsettling because it undermines the comfort people take in their ability to read danger. Meanwhile, survivors move through decades with bodies primed for danger. Hypervigilance becomes muscle memory. Sleep fractures into light segments. A floorboard creak produces a full adrenaline surge. Many installed additional locks, slept with phones within reach, changed bedrooms monthly, or left radios on at night to soften the silence. Relationships strained under the repetition of checking, rechecking, making the home a fortress that still never felt secure. The ripple was not only personal. Children learned to scan faces. Partners learned not to touch from behind. Therapy helped some. Others found routines that felt like safety. But the baseline remained elevated. The phone calls for those who received them echoed decades later. A whisper, breathing, a word said in that low cadence that brought the past into the room. Memory forms its own evidence, and in courtrooms across California, survivors carried that evidence with a calm that came from practice. Impact statements were not dramatic performances. They were steady accounts of a life rerouted by fear. A woman spoke about keeping a packed bag by the door. A man explained why he still sleeps with keys in his hand. The small details mattered because they demonstrated the crime's half-life, the slow burn through years that never quite ended. When he finally appeared in court, frail, in an orange jumpsuit, the ledger turned. There would be no trial. He took a plea, guilty to multiple murders, and admitted to hundreds of crimes under an unusual structure that allowed the record to be read into public memory. For hours, prosecutors recited addresses, dates, acts. The cadence was clinical by design, stripping away drama, leaving sequence and fact. The effect on the room was cumulative. Faces closed, hands gripped tissues, names returned to the center, not as headlines, but as people held in language. What stands out now in retrospect is how police culture at the time insulated someone like him. He knew protocols because he had been inside them. He anticipated patrol rhythms, radio response times, the limits of evidence handling. That does not implicate entire departments. It highlights fragmentation, the separate silos where cases lived and died. The cost of that fragmentation was not only tactical. It landed on people who kept waiting for their fear to be recognized as connected to someone else's fear 2 counties away. In the end, the double life was not glamorous. It was tedious, sustained by secrecy and the confidence that institutions were slow. Survivors carried the heavier load. They adapted. They raised families, built careers, traveled in daylight, and still checked the back seat at night. The question of why he stopped is less important to them than the fact that they never got to. They endured, and when the names were finally said in a single room, endurance sounded like truth. Era limitations shaped the hunt. Records lived on paper, in manila folders, stacked in metal cabinets that rarely crossed county lines. Patrol cars did not share databases. and detectives guarded cases because that was the culture. The science was blunt: blood typing, shoe impressions, fibers, useful but narrow. DNA profiling existed only in concept for most of the crime spree, then arrived too late to connect a name. The psychology of the moment is important. Institutions believed crime had a local center of gravity. He exploited that belief by moving, gendered victim-blaming blurred signals. Survivors faced questions framed as cautionary tales: why the window? Why the neighborhood? Why that hour? When the real answer was the offender's preparation. In public meetings, fear sometimes turned into instructions for women rather than resources for collective safety. That misdirection slowed recognition. Meanwhile, he refined forensic minimalism: gloves, pre-cut ligatures, soft entry on sliding doors, telephone lines clipped, toilets flushed to remove fluids. He rehearsed silence at a time when silence defeated labs. His methodology was patient. Days of surveillance, calls to test routines, garage doors watched from shadowed corners. He mapped escape routes along canals, bike paths, green belts, liminal spaces where sound dispersed. He cached items, recovered them later, and left with almost nothing. What stands out now in retrospect is the rehearsal loop. Each attack taught him a small lesson. He applied it methodically. He punished resistance, not in rage, but as enforcement of a private rulebook. The geography strategy hid him. When pressure rose in Sacramento, he went south. When Orange County organized, he paused, then struck in a different jurisdiction where the name was different and the evidence sat apart. Separate agencies meant separate evidence lockers, and without the unifying anchor of a DNA name, pattern remained a word, not proof. The result was erasure without a trace. His movements dissolved into different headlines, different task forces, different fear. Law enforcement was not inert. Cold case persistence mattered. Detectives preserved kits, boxed ligatures, labeled reels of 35mm negatives. Retirees made late-night calls to younger colleagues, pushing for reanalysis. When forensic genealogy arrived, that preservation paid off. But it took policy shifts, standardized evidence sharing, interagency meetings that treated county lines as administrative, not forensic. Modern protocols now anticipate offenders who travel, shared databases, cross-posted bulletins, and codified survivor-centered practices reduce blind spots. Survivor-centered practice corrected another gap. Instead of interrogating choices, investigators now map trauma responses as evidence. Hypervigilance, sensory memory, voice cadence, details once dismissed as subjective, are logged, corroborated, and used to compare offender scripts across incidents. The psychology of the moment leads. People under threat do not perform clarity. They survive. Recognizing that made interviews more precise and comparisons more reliable. Open questions remain. Unknown offenses likely exist. Earlier burglaries, unreported assaults, prowls that never escalated because circumstances shifted. The Cordova Cat burglaries, the Visalia Ransacker series, investigators considered overlaps, but attribution requires care. Theories are not facts. There are psychological roots we can describe: control, humiliation, grievance, but any childhood narrative is speculation, unless supported by records. What we can say: he learned law enforcement rhythms from the inside, he practiced domination in stages, and he banked on fragmentation to stay invisible. The lessons are procedural and human. Procedural: build systems that assume mobility and repetition. Preserve everything, digitize early, and push evidence into shared spaces so patterns can surface quickly. Human: stop offloading responsibility onto victims. Embed trauma literacy in every interview room. But here's the twist: even perfect systems do not remove harm already done. They only shorten the time between injury and identification. The goal is to compress decades into months, months into days. Everything was about to pass into legacy. Cases closed, names spoken, processes rewritten. Closure for some, not for all. The ledger can be read, the nights cannot be returned. Let's get to story number 2. Dawn at Cabin 28 felt wrong, a silence that didn't belong to a Sunday. Inside, they found bodies bound with tape and cord, blunt force trauma everywhere, a small survivor asleep in a back room, untouched. How many attackers were there? Why the brutality? What motive could sustain it? It was April 1981 in Keddie, a struggling Sierra Nevada resort town where neighbors heard more than they reported. and fear traveled faster than facts. Families locked doors that never had locks. To understand the discovery that morning, we need to track the hours before the living room turned into a crime scene. Sue Sharp's household moved in practical rhythms. Dinner late, kids negotiating sleepovers, a mother stretching paychecks. Recent separation meant new rules, but the cabin doors still opened to night air, the way mountain towns breathe. Teen plans crisscrossed. Sheila arranged to sleep at a friend's place. Tina drifted between cabins. The boys traded television and snacks. Neighbors came and went, familiar faces blending with transient renters who paid by the week. The layout mattered. Tight rooms, a narrow hall, the living room as crossroads. Community dynamics set the stage. Keddie was a fading resort with cabins patched by necessity, not pride. Money was thin, gossip thick. At the bar, regulars traded stories. A few newcomers drew stares, and names did not always stick. Reported sightings that evening were fragmented. A man in sunglasses after dark. A truck idling longer than made sense. Voices outside that stopped when someone looked. The psychology of the moment is important. Vulnerability layered quietly. Open doors justified by habit. Trust extended because strangers quickly became neighbors. Phones chirped with last calls. Kids checked in, promised to behave. A porch light flicked on, then off, conserving bulbs. Inside, Sue folded laundry, a small domestic anchor at the end of a thin day. Unknown to them, across the road, lines blurred. Who belonged? Who hovered? The cabins were close enough for sound to travel, but not cleanly. A shout could bend with the trees and land nowhere. Everything looked ordinary, because ordinary in Keddie already included risk. Then the living room would bear the cost. The living room was compressed violence. 2 adult victims were bound with tape and cord, the bindings layered as if applied, adjusted, then reinforced. A knife and a hammer lay within reach, not carelessly dropped, but placed where attention would land. Blood-coated walls and carpet in arcs that suggested repeated strikes, not a single outburst. Overkill, investigators said. Force well beyond what was needed to subdue. The air held copper and dust. A silence that came after shouting. Stakes appear in the smallest details. Tape across mouths, then removed and reapplied, indicated attempts to silence, then statements forced, then more silence. Wrists were wrapped tight, ankles crossed or spread, the angles inconsistent, as if different hands tied them. Cord came from more than one source. Some lengths matched hardware store utility line, others looked cut from inside the home. The psychology of the moment is important. Control was the priority, but the method was not streamlined. It looked like group aggression under stress, each participant asserting a piece of dominance. Blood spatter patterns told a partial story. Some cast-off swept upward toward a lamp, backhanded strikes from a standing position. Near the sofa, a low-velocity pool indicated a victim remained on the floor for a period, while blows continued elsewhere. There were gaps, areas that should have shown transfer but did not, as if surfaces had been wiped. Missing blood trails complicated entry and exit narratives. If attackers left through the front, more should have been visible on the porch. Investigators considered staging, selected wipes to distort sequence, bodies repositioned to send a message or mask a failed plan. Survivors in the back room were untouched. A chilling contrast. The boys slept through or feigned sleep, their isolation suggesting purposeful containment or simple neglect amid chaos. One child was missing, Tina, changing the frame from a brutal home invasion to a hybrid crime scene, homicide plus abduction. That shift matters. Multiple offenders are more likely when simultaneous control of spaces is required, and the logistics of removing a child while others are restrained point to coordination or a fractured improvisation that accidentally achieved separation. Indicators of staging multiplied. A window shade partially drawn from the bottom, as if someone wanted to control visibility from outside without losing a view. A phone taken off the hook, then replaced incorrectly, leaving a deadline. Drawers pulled just enough to imply ransack, but not fully emptied. The arrangement felt curated, yet inconsistent. Certain object placements looked intentional, others chaotic, which investigators read as a blend of message and panic. The bindings themselves became evidence with voice. Medical tape was not standard household stock for every cabin. Sourcing it suggested pre-planning or access to supplies through work or a neighbor. Cord lengths were cut with a blade already blooded, implying sequence. Violence first, restraint adjusted mid-assault. Knots varied, one square knot, one slip knot, again suggesting more than one set of hands. Forensic minimalism was not evident. Fingerprints may have been smudged, but gloves did not dominate the scene. That absence is unusual and unsettling for offenders confident enough to linger. Missing items created negative space. A knife from the kitchen was used, but another knife was missing entirely. Personal items, possibly taken as trophies or simply pocketed as panic artifacts, were gone. If trophy taking occurred, it adds a ritual layer, an attempt to retain power beyond the room, to carry evidence of the night into private space. But here is the twist. Some missing objects were small and common. Their absence could be noise. Investigators distinguished between symbolic items and random loss, careful not to build motive from coincidence. Noise complaints, recorded later, mapped poorly onto the layout. A neighbor heard a muffled yell around midnight. Another noted a thud nearer to 2 in the morning. The cabin's construction, thin walls, shared crawl spaces, loose windows, turned sound into rumor. What stands out now in retrospect is that time inside the room stretched. This was not a rapid blitz. The arrangement of bindings, the layering of tape, the repositioning of bodies, all imply duration. With duration comes risk, which offenders typically reduce by bringing familiarity, either to the victims or the environment. Psychologically, the scene reads as performative violence, control through terror, escalation as demonstration, not only to victims but to one another if multiple offenders were present. Orders barked, compliance enforced, then anger when compliance did not satisfy a need that was never about information. Group aggression often produces overkill because boundaries dissolve. The hammer's presence alongside a knife speaks to opportunistic weapon use, improvisation from what is at hand, but sustained application reveals intentions stabilized by adrenaline and mutual reinforcement. In the aftermath, law enforcement faced too many leads and too little cohesion. Each detail invited a theory, and the scene's mixed signals, staging and sincerity blended, kept investigators oscillating between targeted grievance and opportunistic cruelty. The immediate consequence was paralysis. A wide suspect pool, overlapping motives, and evidence that hinted at multiple attackers without naming them. The ripple effects were worse. Families measured sleep in minutes. Children learned to decode adult whispers, and a single missing child turned the living room into a map with no clear exit. Known names surfaced early because proximity always speaks first. Martin Smart, Marty, lived steps from cabin 28. His friend, John Beau Boubaid, drifted through town with a reputation for bluster and a taste for attention. Both placed themselves within the orbit of the Sharps in the days before the murders. Marty's marriage was strained. His wife, Marilyn, knew Sue, and neighbors described tension that did not need much oxygen to grow. In a small place, resentments scale fast. What stands out now in retrospect is the mix of opportunity and grievance. If the violence was performative, who was the audience? The psychology of the moment is important. Marty reportedly disliked Sue's influence on Marilyn, believing Sue encouraged independence. That belief, if true, converts a domestic grievance into a combustible motive. Beau, meanwhile, lent swagger and a second set of hands. Investigators considered whether Marty needed backup to sustain control in a room that turned into chaos. Statements twisted the narrative. Marilyn later said, Marty confessed in therapy, telling a counselor he killed Sue and Tina. The phrasing, carried through memory, raises evidentiary problems: therapy, privilege, hearsay, the reliability of recollection under stress. Law enforcement interviewed the counselor, but records of what was said and when are inconsistent across retellings. Marty also wrote a letter to Marilyn after the murders, apologizing for meanness and blaming her love for Sue. The letter is not a confession, but it tightens the frame around motive, jealousy, control, resentment. Beau's contradictions multiplied. He boasted in bars, then denied specifics in interviews. He reportedly claimed connections to organized crime, a tactic that can inflate fear and muddy timelines. Polygraphs entered the file, but polygraphs are not science. They detect physiology, not truth. Results were labeled inconclusive or deception indicated, language that reads definitive but sits on shaky ground. The investigative problem is simple. Polygraphs can shape suspicion without adding admissible weight. Law enforcement gaps complicated everything. Evidence custody appears to have faltered. Photographs were misfiled, reports went missing, and items that might have yielded later DNA work were either lost or degraded. Some detectives argued resources were low and caseloads high. Others said pressure should have forced discipline. Jurisdictions overlapped awkwardly, county, state, and federal interest rising and falling with media attention. The consequence was fragmentation, interviews conducted without cross-referencing, rumors entered as notes, follow-ups delayed until memories cooled. Micro-stories tied to suspects carry caution. A neighbor said Marty burned clothes in his yard soon after the murders. Another remembered Bo leaving town abruptly. A hammer consistent with the weapon was later found in a nearby pond, reportedly identified by family as Marty's. But here is the twist. Consistency is not exclusivity. Hammers are common. Ponds hide more than guilt. Investigators balance these details against the absence of direct forensic links. No preserved fingerprints, no definitive blood typing connecting Marty or Bo to the room. Meanwhile, competing motives emerged. Was Sue the primary target, with others collateral? Or did an argument escalate during a late-night visit that spun into group violence? The bindings and overkill suggest control first, then rage, not the other way around. That sequencing supports a targeted initiation, layered with opportunism, a confrontation intended to intimidate that became a staged theater of dominance. If so, multiple offenders become likelier because sustained control across rooms with an abduction requires capability beyond one person. Interviews with Marty and Bo produced contradictions in timing and whereabouts. They mentioned a bar, a wood stove, a night drive. They placed themselves together, then apart, then together again. Investigators passed receipts, bartender recollections, and the bar's closing routine. Timelines still leaked. At the time, nobody could anchor the sequence with technology. No cell records, no surveillance video, no card swipes. Memory did the heavy lifting, and memory under fear misorders events. Cold case re-examination decades later introduced new threads. A sealed box revealed additional reports. A note surfaced referencing a therapist's disclosure. A possible DNA hint from tape or a tool was discussed publicly by officials, but specifics remained guarded. Without a published lab match, DNA becomes hope rather than evidence. The analogy is simple. A locked door with a key that might exist somewhere if you can prove chain of custody. Community fear hardened into law. Kids grew up knowing the outline but not the proof. The house was eventually demolished, as if removing walls could quiet a story, yet the names returned with each anniversary. Marty died. Bo died. With them went any potential confession that might have resolved contradictions. Investigators considered whether others were involved, acquaintances who knew anger would be vented that night, or who arrived after the first blows fell and helped stage control. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, because a case file split by time and practice cannot speak beyond its documents. Still, the file points to a narrow circle, proximity bound by grievance and convenience. The likely motive is relational, not random. The likely method is group enforcement, not solo cruelty. And the likely barrier is not lack of theory, but lack of admissible, survivable evidence that can carry a jury from suspicion to certainty. Tina's absence reframed everything. A living room saturated with violence is one story. A child removed from that room, into the dark, is another. The psychology of the moment is important. Abduction under pressure implies either confidence with the terrain or numbers enough to divide tasks. One holds the room, one moves the child, and both believe they can exit without interception. That belief, in a town this small, points toward familiarity. Search began fast, but thinned with distance. Deputies canvassed cabins, traced footpaths to the creek, checked outbuildings, and called her name into timber that absorbs sound. Terrain challenges complicated tactics. Ravines cut behind structures, railroad tracks ran like a corridor through the woods, and the Sierra night erased footprints by dawn. Flyers went up. Roadblocks came and went. Volunteers formed lines. But here is the twist. Without a lead out of the living room, every direction was plausible, and the map felt endless. In the days after, tips flooded in. A girl matching Tina's description near a gas station. A sighting at a highway diner. Could it be her became a ritual question in homes already on edge? Investigators built a grid of possible exits, vehicle routes, footpaths, cabins, where someone might stash a child temporarily. Nothing held. The practical consequence was attrition. Leads aged, statements drifted, and the missing thread began to fray under the weight of competing theories. 3 years later, miles away in Butte County, a small skull surfaced near Camp 18. A local found it, Then an anonymous caller alerted authorities to check for a link to Keddie. That call matters. It suggests knowledge, not chance, and it shifts the narrative from random disappearance to an abduction that ended with disposal at a site chosen for concealment. Forensic confirmation came through dental comparison. Tina was no longer missing. She was evidence in another place, on a timeline that did not end in the cabin. The impact was immediate and layered. For the family, grief compounded fear, mourning tethered to a geography they had not anticipated. For investigators, the recovery introduced a second scene, sparse but instructive. There was no rich blood pattern, no bindings to read. Instead, there were questions about transport. Was a vehicle used the night of the murders, or did someone return later, when patrol patterns relaxed? Distance reduces the pool to those with access, time, and a reason to manage risk across counties. The abduction component strengthens the multiple offender theory. Moving a child demands attention, and attention divides control. If the living room violence took time, and the bindings suggest it did, then removing Tina required either a lull created by dominance or a handoff to someone waiting outside. Both scenarios speak to coordination. The logistics argue against a lone actor improvising flawlessly through two crime scenes. Family impact is often recounted clinically in files, notified, interviewed, provided with resources. The lived reality is sharper. Siblings grew up with a permanent gap at the table. Each birthday became a calibration point. Where would Tina have been in school? What music would she have liked? Their mother's decisions were scrutinized unfairly. A familiar pattern in cases where poverty and single parenthood invite judgment instead of support. The cost of that judgment is silence. Families withdraw, interviews shorten, and vital nuance drains from the record. What stands out now, in hindsight, is the system's fragmentation. 2 counties, 2 scenes, and an era without integrated data. Evidence that could have been cross-referenced lived in separate boxes. The anonymous call, if recorded, if preserved, might still hold acoustic or linguistic markers, but chain of custody gaps limit reanalysis. Modern practice would geofence phones, pull traffic cams, scrape license plate readers, and mine touch DNA from tape. In 1981, investigators had paper maps and radio chatter. Tina's recovery did not resolve motive, but it clarified intent. This was not chaos alone, it was control projected into the woods. Abduction widened the harm, converting a household attack into a regional wound that, even now, resists closure. Start with what holds. Multiple weapons, bindings with medical tape and cord, and injuries consistent with sustained, performative violence. The living room shows layered control, restraints applied, adjusted and reinforced, suggesting more than one attacker or one attacker moving between tasks over time. The untouched children in the back room point to compartmentalization, either deliberate containment or chaotic neglect. Tina's removal converts the scene into dual crimes, homicide and abduction. Those are firm anchors. Probable dynamics narrow from there. Targeted rather than random remains the most coherent reading. The social orbit placed Sue at friction points. Advice to friends. A presence some men resented. If a domestic grievance walked through that door, intimidation could morph into group aggression once control was established. Overkill follows when anger tries to prove itself in front of witnesses or accomplices, and when threats cannot be retracted because escalation has already committed the room. Investigative barriers were not abstract. They were procedural. A small sheriff's office faced a scene that would test any agency. Evidence custody lacked redundancy, notes went unindexed, and inter-county information sharing depended on personal relationships rather than protocol. Polygraphs consumed time and produced ambiguity. The result was linkage blindness within a single case. Interviews, rumors, and forensic fragments lived in parallel, rather than converging into a central map that could be updated and audited. What we do not know remains stubborn. How many attackers were in the room from the start? Did a second or third person arrive mid-assault? Which blows were punitive? Which were instrumental to regain control? Was staging intended to signal something to the community, or to mislead investigators about sequence and motive? Without a fully preserved chain of custody, modern tools cannot answer all of those questions retroactively. Modern reassessment offers limited but real promise. Items retained, tape, cord, tools, may still carry touch DNA, though degradation over decades and environmental exposure reduce the odds. Digitized reports allow pattern analysis that was not feasible then. Comparing phrase usage in statements, timing patterns across witness accounts, and cross-referencing vehicle descriptions that were never collated. A unified digital casebook also exposes contradictions for re-interview. Even if the original witnesses are gone, associates and family can still clarify logistics around alibis and movements. The psychological profile that survives the file emphasizes group dynamics over lone wolf sadism, control through terror, status performance, a need to dominate witnessed by peers. In groups, aggression escalates as boundaries dissolve, and staging becomes both message and mask. The abducted child amplifies that profile. Removal under pressure requires planning or numbers, and either choice points away from an opportunistic stranger and towards someone navigating known terrain with confidence. Ongoing theories cluster around named suspects from the neighborhood and a broader network of acquaintances who enabled, witnessed, or later helped shape the narrative. The named suspects fit proximity and motive, but admissible evidence remains thin. What evidence could resolve it now? A recoverable DNA profile from bindings or tools that survives comparison. A verified document or recording that captures a contemporaneous admission. Corroborated transport details linking a vehicle to both scenes by time and place. Failing that, a credible, detailed confession with independent, non-public facts. Lessons sharpen with time. Preserve everything twice. Build interoperable systems so small offices do not carry a structural disadvantage. Treat rumor as data only when it is sourced, dated, and tested against other records. And center survivors and families without turning them into defendants of their choices. The psychology of the moment is important. People under siege make practical decisions in a constrained world. Policy should reflect that reality, not rewrite it later. The outline after decades is blunt. Confirmed brutality, likely multiple offenders, targeted grievance, fractured investigation, partial staging, and an abduction that widened the wound. The rest sits in boxes that still need a bridge. And let's get to story number 3. Patrol lights washed over Belhaven's hedges when they found her, a 15-year-old near a backyard tree, a bent golf club splintered beside her. The night before had been mischief and teenage noise. The morning was quiet, except for radios. Who from that circle had access? Which story would hold? It was October 1975, an enclave that prized privacy as protection. A family would spend decades seeking answers, while a community negotiated reputation. To understand the evidence, we retrace Martha's last hours. The afternoon slid into evening with a familiar ritual, mischief night in Greenwich. The kind teenagers turn into wandering circles of jokes and door knocks. Martha's diary had named the orbit, friends she liked, friends who pushed boundaries, and the neighbors across the lane, the Skakel boys, who carried a particular gravity. The psychology of the moment is important. Adolescence runs on proximity and small dares, and Belhaven's quiet streets made proximity feel harmless. After dinner, Martha left home around 7:30 p.m., cutting through yards into safe, known space. She landed where the neighborhood often converged: driveways, side lawns, a stop at the Skakel property, a large house with siblings and visitors moving in and out. Voices layered over tennis courts and hedges, the kind of sound that registers as background. Witnesses would later describe flirtations and teasing, a small push, a laugh that felt too loud, then quiet again. In hindsight, these moments matter because they define access, who was close enough to escalate, and who had reason to return. Timing began to loosen. Friends recalled a window from roughly 8 to 9 p.m., when the group drifted between the Moxley yard and the Skakel driveway. A reported roughhousing episode, jealousy cues, a shove near a tree, became a focal point, not for its drama, but for the way it shows social tension in motion. A few kids peeled off for other houses. A car ride was discussed by some, denied by others. The details never settled into a clean ledger, because teenagers remember emotion more reliably than minutes. Meanwhile, adults in the enclave observed the noise with indulgence. A neighbor looked out at one point and saw figures moving near the Skakel lawn, then closed blinds, because this was Belhaven and the assumption of safety ran deep. Another heard laughter, then a thud-like sound later, uncertain of the hour. What stands out now in retrospect is that sound in this neighborhood traveled strangely, clipped by hedges, softened by distance, so audio memory fractured before it reached a statement. The club entered the story as a household item, not a weapon, a Tony Penner iron from a set belonging to the Skakel residence. That detail links home to violence without fixing time. At some point, Martha parted from the core group, Some accounts place her last near the Skakel driveway around 9:30 p.m. Others suggest she started back toward her yard shortly after. She was comfortable with shortcuts, hedge gaps, side paths, and those shortcuts, at the time, weren't considered risky. Inside the Skakel house, narratives diverged. Siblings and a cousin spoke later of television, a supposed late drive to a family member's place, and a shifting alibi architecture that changed over years. The psychology of the moment is important. A large household with adolescents creates overlapping stories that are hard to audit, especially when reputation sits in the background as quiet pressure. You can feel the social calculation, say enough to appear helpful, but not enough to entangle. Back at the Moxley home, curfew expectations were flexible. Martha's mother believed she'd return around 9:30. When she didn't, calls began. To friends, to neighbors. Teen responders offered versions colored by panic's early stages. She left a little before us, or she was headed home, statements that satisfy concern without supplying anchors. Those early hours matter because they shape the first map. Adults traced likely routes, the direct walk, the loop by the lane, and found nothing obvious out of place. Witness accounts introduced small mysteries. A neighbor's dog barked around 10 p.m. Another resident reported a figure crossing near the Moxley property, closer to 10:30. A sudden quiet followed, a pause that, in hindsight, suggests isolation rather than continued group movement. The missing time window, roughly 10 to midnight, became the gap where opportunity, access, and impulse could align without a crowd. Adolescent bravado ran through the night, but so did alcohol. Several teens acknowledged drinking. Others implied it without saying it. Alcohol blurs perception and hardens confidence, which matters when power dynamics and jealousy already circulate. Poor supervision wasn't negligence so much as a cultural norm. Adults nearby, not hovering. The belief that neighborhood wealth equaled insulation. By 11 p.m., worry deepened at the Moxley home. Phone calls widened. A parent drove slowly through the enclave, headlights low, scanning hedges and tree lines. The return brought no relief. Sleep became shallow, hours of waiting, listening for the front door, then the first pass of patrol lights at dawn. The transition from a social evening to a disaster scene wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, a series of benign decisions that, layered together, left a 15-year-old alone at the wrong moment. What stands out now is the connective tissue. Movements measured in yards, interactions measured in minutes, and a set of people with both access and motive threads woven through a single block. The night didn't announce itself as dangerous. It presented as ordinary, then shifted, quietly, into a chilling mystery that would stretch across decades. Morning light revealed a small radius of devastation. Martha lay near a pine tree on her family's property, partially concealed by low shrubs. A golf club, aluminum shaft, Tony Penner brand, was splintered close by, its head separated, fragments scattered in a short arc. Blunt force trauma dominated the scene, with injuries consistent with multiple strikes. Drag marks, faint and discontinuous, suggested she'd been moved a short distance, not carried far, an attempt to hide her, without planning for true concealment. Stakes are immediate in the quiet details. Her position near the tree line indicated the assault likely occurred on or just off the lawn, not deep in the hedgerow. A shoe scuff on the grass stopped abruptly, as if a foot lost balance or braced for impact. The shrub cover was minimal, a hurried staging rather than effective camouflage. In affluent neighborhoods, landscaping functions like walls, but here it became a partial curtain, enough for a perpetrator to feel hidden in the dark. What investigators could collect in 1975 was limited. DNA wasn't yet in play. They worked with fibers, hair, blood typing, and tool impressions. The club fragments were crucial because they belonged to a set from a nearby residence, linking instrument to neighborhood. The break pattern looked violent, not fatigue-based, the shaft fractured from repeated force. Blood spatter on the fragment edges was inconsistent, some smears, some fine cast-off, signaling movement during impact rather than a single stationary blow. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the perimeter. Yard-to-yard sweeps recovered few usable footprints. Ground conditions were a problem. Autumn lawns hold shape poorly, and overnight dew softens edges. A possible shoe impression lacked clear tread identity, which meant no brand, no size with confidence. Dogs canvassed adjacent properties, reacting at fence lines, then losing scent where paved drives disrupted the trail. The path of retreat dissolved into the enclave's curated spaces. Flagstone, clipped turf, trimmed beds. The golf club's origin gave investigators a narrow corridor of access. If the club came from the Skakel set, how did it travel outdoors, and when? Was it borrowed earlier, or taken impulsively during the night? The psychology of the moment is important. Using a household item reduces premeditation markers. It suggests escalation from confrontation to violence, aided by proximity to a ready weapon. Still, escalation doesn't equal chaos. The blows were numerous, the force sustained. That reads as anger stabilized by adrenaline rather than a brief flash. There were hints of staging. The partial shrub cover, the body moved a few feet. The club fragments left both near and slightly away from the core scene. These acts suggest a perpetrator trying to reduce immediate visibility at dawn. But the staging didn't extend into deeper deception. No attempt to mask blood with soil. No consistent wiping of contact points on nearby surfaces. In hindsight, that limited staging feels like a calculation. Hide enough to buy time, then leave quickly. Forensic contamination risks were high. Neighbors arrived, officers moved in and out, and scene control tightened only after initial discovery. Gloves and evidence bags were used, but 1970s protocols lacked today's rigor for trace collection. A hair can ride in on a cuff. A fiber can drift from a jacket onto damp grass. Investigators knew this, but constraints remained. The file later reflects cautious phrasing. Possible transfer. Cannot exclude. Because certainty, here, would be overreach. A telling detail was silence. No broad chorus of alarms. No window glass shatter reported. That silence supports a brief, localized assault, likely outdoors, away from indoor echoes. A neighbor's dog barked sometime late, but dogs bark for reasons that vanish with the night. The absence of a clean auditory anchor leaves the window of time elastic, and elastic time is a gift to anyone trying to slip between statements. The club's association with a specific household created gravity in the investigation. But gravity isn't proof. Access in Belhaven was social. Kids drifted between yards, equipment moved, and property lines felt symbolic. What stands out now, in retrospect, is that the most incriminating object was also the most ordinary. A piece of sports gear common to the setting. The case needed that object to speak, but the era's tools couldn't extract a voice beyond blood type and ownership context. In the end, the scene reads as proximity turned lethal. A confrontation, an improvised weapon, sustained force, a hurried concealment by shrubs, then retreat into familiar darkness. The evidence could circle suspects, but it couldn't name them. Focus narrowed almost immediately to the neighbors with access and motive threads, and in Belhaven, that meant the Skakel household. Brothers Thomas and Michael appeared in overlapping accounts, their timelines elastic, their alibis evolving across years. The psychology of the moment is important. In a high-status home, pressure moves quietly, reputational gravity shapes memory, and stories begin to serve the household first, the record second. Early statements placed Tommy, near Martha in the evening window. Friends remembered flirtation, a brief physical scuffle that looked like adolescent bravado. Tommy later said he and Martha were together outside for a time, then parted. That admission situates him at the boundary of opportunity, but not inside the fatal window. Michael, younger, initially described limited contact that night, anchoring himself to television, then a late excursion away from the property in a family car with relatives and a tutor. The car trip is the hinge. If true, it moves Michael out of the zone. If untrue or misremembered, it leaves the door open. The household alibi architecture shifted. Decades later, Michael's narrative changed under the weight of treatment center confessions and testimony. Peers from a private school program recounted statements in which Michael allegedly described sexual contact with Martha near the tree, rage, and a frantic scene. Defense teams challenged those accounts, motive to embellish, memory contaminated by news cycles, peer dynamics in institutional settings. But here's the twist. Even contested confessional anecdotes create narrative gravity. They force juries and investigators to reconcile inconsistent self-portraits with otherwise thin physical evidence. Tommy's statements evolved too, though less dramatically. He acknowledged being with Martha earlier, but denied involvement in the assault. A tutor, Kenneth Littleton, entered the orbit as an adult presence in the house that night. Newly hired and reportedly drinking, he became a convenient alternative suspect in some tellings, an outsider, stressed, possibly unstable. Investigators pursued him hard. Years later, civil litigation and interviews suggested he was more a vessel for the family's deflection than a coherent suspect. Littleton's own accounts were erratic, but erratic isn't the same as culpable, and the physical evidence never pinned him to the scene. Meanwhile, diary entries from Martha added texture, not proof. She wrote of dynamics with both Skakel brothers: affection, annoyance, the push-pull common to teenagers, but courts treat diaries as context, not confession or exoneration. They show motive themes: jealousy, access, boundary testing. They do not speak to the minute a weapon rose and fell. The club's origin from the Skakel set anchored suspicion geographically, but as we've said, ownership is not identity, especially in a neighborhood where equipment drifted across lawns like stray thoughts. Investigators collected a lattice of witness recollections. A friend remembered seeing Martha near the Skakel driveway around 9:30 p.m. Another placed Michael preparing for or returning from that contested car trip, a route to a cousin's home across town. The car story grew mechanical legs in later proceedings. Who drove, who sat where, which stoplights they hit. Without contemporary logs, it remained a memory play. In hindsight, the absence of a firm time-stamped anchor, no toll records, no cameras, left jurors to weigh tone and consistency over hard data. Rumored admissions multiplied in the long shadow of the case. Years after the murder, an acquaintance claimed Tommy made incriminating comments. Another said Michael confessed details only a perpetrator would know. Defense attorneys labeled these as contaminated by decades of media exposure. Prosecutors countered that certain details weren't public. Courts referee these disputes by looking for independent corroboration, non-public facts, specificity about sequence, sensory detail that rings true. The record contains flashes of that specificity, but not always with airtight provenance. What stands out now in retrospect is that multiple narratives were competing for primacy. The jealous teen encounter turned deadly, the outsider adult in crisis, the roving intruder theory that tried to pull attention away from the immediate orbit. The intruder theory struggled against access realities. Belhaven wasn't impenetrable, but it was layered with gatekeepers, and the weapon's origin argued for proximity. The outsider adult theory bore the hallmarks of a household seeking to export risk. The adolescent jealousy narrative fit the social physics: proximity, impulse, a weapon at hand. Media pressure became its own character. Books and documentaries pushed particular angles, sometimes elevating dubious witnesses, sometimes surfacing overlooked files. The narrative turned into a battleground where advocacy blurred with investigation. The psychology of the moment is important. With status on one side and a grieving family on the other, the public absorbed dueling certainty, while the evidence stayed stubbornly circumstantial. Then came Michael Skakel's trial in 2002, built on a circumstantial spine: shifting alibis, treatment center testimonies, prior bad acts presented to show a pattern of impulsive, violent behavior. Jurors were asked to bridge the gap between behavioral propensity and a specific act under cover of night. The verdict, guilty, answered the narrative competition, but only temporarily. Appeals reframed the case as a test of process. Was counsel effective? Were alternative suspects presented? Did the jury hear a balanced record? Competing narratives never resolved into a single, uncontested story. Instead, they formed a layered mosaic. Adolescence with access and motive tensions, an adult tutor used as a narrative decoy, and a community inclined to protect its own. The absence of definitive forensic anchors meant memory and credibility carried unusual weight. In that environment, confessions, rumored, partial, contested, became the loudest instruments, even as their notes wavered under scrutiny. By 2002, the case entered a courtroom shaped less by forensics and more by narrative architecture. Prosecutors built their spine from shifting alibis, treatment center testimonies about alleged admissions, and prior bad acts meant to sketch impulse and volatility. Jurors heard about the golf club set, the proximity, the window of opportunity. The psychology of the moment is important. Without a clean lab anchor, credibility became evidence. The verdict, guilty of murder, landed with relief for the Moxley family and a sense, for the defense, that process had overwhelmed proof. Appeals began immediately, centering on ineffective assistance of counsel. The argument was surgical. Trial counsel failed to present certain alternative suspect theories with vigor, did not exploit inconsistencies in state witnesses enough, and underused alibi corroboration that might have complicated the timeline. In 2013, the Connecticut Appellate Court overturned the conviction, emphasizing strategic omissions that, in their view, undermined confidence in the verdict. What stands out now in retrospect is how the law disentangles outcome from method. Even a plausible narrative must survive procedural scrutiny. But here's the twist. In 2016, the state's highest court reinstated the conviction, concluding that counsel's performance, while imperfect, met constitutional standards. The pendulum swung again in 2018, when the conviction was vacated after further review highlighted specific failures, most notably, not calling an alibi witness whose testimony could have placed Michael Skakel away during the critical window. The psychology of the moment is important. Courts do not declare innocence. They test whether a trial's framework produced a trustworthy result. Due process is not sentiment, it is structure. Prosecutors weighed a retrial. They had a record that convinced one jury, but key witnesses had aged, memories had thinned, and the media environment guaranteed a spectacle that could overshadow nuance. Resource calculus mattered. Reassembling decades-old testimony, guarding against contamination from prior coverage, and presenting a circumstantial case to a new panel is a steep climb. Ultimately, the state declined to retry, leaving the legal posture at a vacuum. No active conviction, no exoneration, only an unresolved file with a long shadow. For the Moxley family, endurance defined the aftermath. They had lived with process as a second loss, hearings, headlines, reversals. Their stance remained steady. Martha's life deserved a verdict anchored in more than privilege or pressure. For the Skakel family, the message was different. The system, at last, had corrected itself. Both families spoke from places shaped by decades of scrutiny, where every sentence felt like evidence and every silence like strategy. What did the evidence actually say? In the end, it said access and opportunity converged on a small circle. It said the weapon came from nearby, the timeline was elastic, and credibility would have to carry burden that science could not. The legal saga did not answer who swung the club. It answered whether the machinery that named someone had done so with reliability. The appellate record became the case's clearest mirror, reflecting a chilling mystery made heavier by process. In the aftermath, the community adjusted to ambiguity. A backyard remained a landmark. Lawyers taught seminars using the case as a study in circumstantial prosecutions, appellate narrowness, and the danger of narrative momentum. And the file, digitized and indexed, still waits for a test result that might yet arrive, the kind modern tools sometimes coax from objects that seemed silent for good. What do the physical anchors still support? The golf club fragments traced to the neighboring set, the body positioned near shrub cover, the short drag distance, and a likely outdoor assault within a narrow radius. Those details reinforce proximity and access, not elaborate premeditation. The scene shows sustained force and hurried concealment, reading as escalation from confrontation rather than a planned abduction or transport. The window of time remains elastic, but the geography is tight, and that matters. What do witness accounts suggest? Motive themes recur. Jealousy, adolescent rivalry, boundary pushing. Multiple friends place Martha within conversational reach of the Skakel property in the crucial evening hour. Accounts diverge on the car trip, the television timeline, and who was where after 9:30, but the social gravity points toward the same cluster of people. Credibility issues persist because memory under stress reshapes sequence, and later publicity can backfill details, creating confidence without accuracy. Courts know this. They look for cross points, small consistencies that survived before headlines hardened. The role of class and access is unavoidable. Belhaven's insulation produced a reflex to manage exposure. Gatehouses, last names, and reputational equity turn investigators into diplomats as much as detectives. The psychology of the moment is important. When adults with influence mediate teen narratives, statements start to serve the household stability. That does not equal conspiracy. It describes a pressure field where truth bends slightly, repeatedly, until timelines look orderly enough to pass scrutiny. Forensic limits in 1975 created a ceiling: no touch DNA, no stable low-copy analysis, no integrated neighborhood camera nets, and scene control that began after contamination risks had already walked through. Could modern methods help now? Possibly, with reanalysis of preserved items, club fragments, clothing fibers, latent prints enhanced by contemporary imaging, and mitochondrial DNA from hair shafts, if any were retained, with clean chain of custody. But here's the twist. Even a new profile needs a comparator. and without a named reference or eligible database pathway, a partial profile becomes a sterile fact. What remains unsettled is the precise minute of separation when Martha left a circle and became isolated. The missing auditory anchor keeps the timeline porous, and porous timelines accommodate competing narratives. Was there a brief, consensual encounter that turned violent? Was there an ambush at the hedgerow? The physical record cannot adjudicate intent in that first movement. It only shows what followed. Repeated blows, a break in the club, a short drag, insufficient concealment. Memory, however, has its own evidentiary value when handled carefully. Early statements given before media saturation carry more weight than late recollections. Diaries supply contemporaneous context for motive themes, not culpability. Institutional confessions, especially those filtered through peers, require non-public corroboration to move from rumor to proof. The appellate record reminds us that process can correct outcomes without rewriting the facts on the ground. Due process scrutinizes scaffolding, not grief. So where does that leave the case? With a narrow social field, a neighborhood weapon, a plausible jealousy motive, and unresolved conflicts in alibi architecture. With a victim whose last night was ordinary until it was not. With a file that asks technology to bridge gaps built by culture and time. Investigators considered running new roundtables, timeline reconstructions using synchronized statements, mapping second by second where possible. Even that effort grapples with loss. People move, memories calcify, and incentive structures shift. The path forward is incremental. Reassess preserved materials with current labs. Audit the earliest statements for consistent anchors. Evaluate whether any non-public details from reported admissions match the scene in ways only the perpetrator would know. And, if a viable profile emerges, test legally available genealogical avenues within the constraints of state policy. The boundary between truth and influence still runs through a Greenwich backyard. Crossing it will require science that speaks softly and documentation that does not blink.